So picture this. It is May of 2026.
Right.
And the global picture is, frankly, looking pretty grim. You've got the Strait of Hormuz, which is, the maritime choke point that handles a massive chunk of the world's oil supply.
Huge percentage.
Right, and it's functionally blocked. There's been this series of really intense naval skirmishes. And meanwhile, over in Washington, D.C., you have U.S. senators just viciously grilling defense officials.
Yeah, they're going after this guy named Hegsa.
Exactly, grilling him over this escalating war involving Iran, plus all these domestic military firings. The global economy is basically shivering.
Oh, absolutely. The tension is palpable everywhere.
And right in the middle of this absolute geopolitical powder keg, this guy publishes a manifesto. He's this self-proclaimed tech utopian, but he also claims his political roots started as, get this, Barack Obama's first full-time grassroots volunteer in New York City.
Which is just a wild combination of backgrounds.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in this manifesto, he doesn't just outline like a standard military strategy. He demands that the Iranian diaspora build this covert logistical supply chain.
Yeah.
And he insists that the prominent global politicians, including the mayor of New York, must publicly renounce their religion to trigger the collapse of the Iranian regime.
I mean, it's a staggering combination of demands to process. You have this highly localized maritime conflict, and he's immediately mapping it onto these global theological mandates.
Right.
And it's all wrapped up in the language of, like, Silicon Valley disruption and tech culture.
Which brings us to what we're doing today.
Right.
We're going to unpack the architecture of this really specific, deeply controversial worldview, because it's a lot to take in.
It's a massive web of ideas.
So the source material for this deep dive is this sprawling blog post. It's titled, Iran, I Have Been Anti-War All Along. And it's published on a site called Barakface.
Written by a guy named Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
Right, Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. And he is incredibly prolific. But before we get into the weeds here, I want to make something crystal clear to you listening right now.
Yes, the disclaimer is really crucial here.
Exactly. Our job today is not to validate this guy's theology. We are not endorsing his political strategies. We aren't taking sides on any of the highly polarizing religious or geopolitical claims he makes.
We are completely neutral observers.
100%. Our job is entirely forensic. We are just looking at the structural integrity of his argument.
We want to show you how he connects grassroots organizing to ancient religious history,
Right, and how he uses the backdrop of 2026 artificial intelligence to justify what ends up being a remarkably hawkish military stance.
And to do that forensically, we have to recognize that this single blog post, it doesn't just exist in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
It is the visible peak of an absolute mountain of published material by Bhagat. If you dive into the archive of this site, which, by the way, goes all the way back to October 2004.
That's like 2 decades of posting.
Exactly. You realize you aren't just reading, everyday political commentary. You are reading the output of someone who operates with this supreme confidence across disciplines that almost never intersect.
I spent hours just looking at his bibliography. It's listed right there on the sidebar of his website. And the sheer volume kind of defies normal categorization.
Oh, it's all over the place.
On one hand, he's writing this hyper-technical, futurist nonfiction. Like he has a book called Physical AWS, How the Logistics Cloud Will Reshape Global Commerce.
Which sounds like standard tech bro literature.
Right. And another is called Lumina AI, the $1 trillion sun. And then another one dissects the technologies behind agentic AI.
And we should probably pause on that for a second, because agentic AI in the context of 2026 isn't just a fun buzzword.
No, it's a massive deal. We're talking about artificial intelligence systems that don't just, answer a prompt or write an email for you.
Right. They independently formulate plans. They execute multi-step goals, interact with other software, all without human oversight.
And Bhagat is deeply, deeply immersed in this reality. He's totally bought in.
He's not just immersed. He is projecting a future heavily dictated by it. But like we said, he doesn't stop at technology.
Yeah, that's where the friction in his worldview really begins to show.
Because right next to a treatise on agentic AI, he has this multilingual fictional series called Gen Z Kranti.
And Kranti means revolution, right?
Exactly. He also has a novel called The Great Subcontinent Uprising. And then from there, he takes this hard, unexpected pivot into what you could call high-level economic theology.
Which is just a wild phrase to even say out loud. Economic theology.
It is. He introduces this concept he calls calcism. You see titles like Calcism, the economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance.
And another one called The Last Age of War, the First Age of Peace. Lord Kalki, Prophecies, and the Path to Global Redemption.
So let's actually define that for a second, because Calcism is basically the underlying engine for a huge amount of his political assumptions.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So in Hindu eschatology, Kalki is prophesied to be the 10th and final avatar of the deity Vishnu.
Right.
And Kalki is supposed to descend to end the Kali Yuga, which is like the darkest, most destructive epoch of human existence. And he ushers in a new era of truth and cosmic order.
So Bhagat has taken this really ancient religious prophecy and essentially Frankensteined it together with modern techno-economics.
Exactly. He explicitly pairs it with concepts like velocity money and liquid computing.
It's fascinating. He envisions this post-scarcity age of abundance driven by AI, but he frames the arrival of that technological utopia as a literal spiritual destiny.
Right, and that synthesis creates a highly deterministic teleological worldview.
Teleological meaning that history is marching toward a very specific predestined endpoint, right?
Yes, exactly. For Bhagat, the arrival of this AI-driven age of abundance isn't just like a cool possibility if we get our act together. It is a required phase of human evolution.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And anything that stands in the way of that evolution, whether it's a political regime or a 1400-year-old theology, he doesn't just see it as a normal political adversary.
He sees it as a cosmic obstacle.
Exactly. An obstacle that absolutely must be dismantled.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us back to the blog post from May 9th, 2026.
Iran, I have been anti-war all along.
Right. The rest of the world is looking at the Strait of Hormuz being blocked, and they're panicking about an economic catastrophe.
But Bhagat looks at that exact same conflict and sees a necessary friction point. He sees it as a way to accelerate his timeline.
So he drops this post. And the very first thing he does is attempt to completely redefine what the term anti-war even means when you're dealing with an entrenched, nuclear ambitious theocracy.
Because, conventional anti-war rhetoric in 2026 usually looks like people advocating for de-escalation or diplomatic summits, maybe returning to a status quo.
Yeah, holding up peace signs and asking for ceasefires.
But Bhagat explicitly rejects that. He states outright that there is zero peace to be had with the current Iranian regime intact.
So his version of being anti-war actually requires the total collapse of the Iranian government.
Precisely. The goal is the same, no war, but the method is aggressive regime change. But where he draws the line is how that collapse happens.
Right. He heavily criticizes what he calls a mindless military kitchen sink strategy.
He's looking at these naval skirmishes and all the U.S. posturing, and his argument is that bombing a country into submission is just inefficient. It's too destructive.
So if he doesn't want the U.S. military to bomb the regime out of existence, what's his solution?
He believes the collapse must be engineered from within, driven entirely by the Iranian diaspora.
This is where his background claiming to be an Obama grassroots organizer really takes the wheel.
Oh, completely.
He takes this monumental geopolitical problem, toppling an entrenched regime, and he reduces it to the mechanics of like a local mayoral political campaign.
Yeah, he instructs the diaspora to form an umbrella organization based on what he calls a common minimum program.
And he says that program should be strictly secular and foundational. He focuses on free speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly.
Which, makes sense on paper. You find the lowest common denominator to maximize the size of your coalition.
Yeah, you want everyone under the tent. But then he takes it a step further, and this is where it gets a little surreal.
Right.
He tells this diaspora coalition that they need to become logistically proficient. And he starts asking these questions that sound way less like a political organizer and way more like a supply chain manager at Amazon.
Exactly. He's asking, what can you move in and out of Iran? How do you manage the flow of information?
Right. He is literally applying the thesis of his book, Physical AWS, to a resistance movement.
That's exactly what he's doing. AWS, Amazon Web Services, they revolutionized the internet by making computing power a flexible, on-demand utility.
And Bhagat is demanding that the Iranian diaspora operate like a human logistical cloud network.
He views the movement of dissident information, the smuggling of resources, the extraction of fleeing citizens. He sees all of that purely as a supply chain problem that can be optimized.
But then you look at his ultimate tactical goal for this supposedly optimized supply chain, and it feels so incredibly disproportionate to the threat.
The phone calls, right.
Yes. After building this massive logistical network, his grand culmination is, and I quote, "And when you are ready, you make 1,000,000 phone calls inside Iran."
1,000,000 phone calls.
I mean, I have to call it the mechanical impossibility of this. In 2026, Iran's telecommunications infrastructure is this heavily surveilled digital fortress.
Oh, it's totally locked down.
We are talking about a state that routinely throttles the internet. They monitor localized cellular networks. They utilize advanced voice recognition and AI surveillance.
Yeah, making 1,000,000 dissident phone calls isn't organizing.
No. Setting up a grassroots phone tree inside that environment is practically building a self-identifying target system for the regime's secret police.
It is a massive, massive vulnerability in his logistical theory. But to be fair to Fagat, he isn't completely blind to the reality on the ground.
No. He makes a specific observation about the military conflict happening around him in May 2026.
He notes that there has been a strategic pause in the external military campaign against Iran.
And rather than calling for a permanent ceasefire, he actually praises the pause. He says it shows thoughtfulness and command and control.
Because he thinks the military pause is doing more damage than the bombs were. He writes that the regime has sustained more political damage since the ceasefire started.
So he's viewing the external military threat as like a pressure cooker.
Exactly. The U.S. and allied forces apply this external existential threat, which forces the Iranian regime to become hyper-paranoid. They tighten their grip.
But Fagat believes the actual mechanism that will shatter the regime isn't that external pressure. He thinks it's the internal boots on the ground.
And he is very emphatic that those must be civilian Iranian boots.
Okay, but this is where his argument hits a massive logical wall.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he actually acknowledges the wall exists.
He does.
He demands these civilian boots on the ground to rise up. But in the exact same section, he describes the Iranian state as ironclad in its degradation.
It's a stark contrast.
Listen to this direct quote from the text. He writes, "Some people say this is like asking the Jews to fight inside the concentration camps. And they have a point. The tyranny inside Iran is just so total."
That's a heavy comparison to make.
It is. And if he admits the tyranny is comparable to a concentration camp, a place of total suffocating control where just surviving day to day is a struggle,
Yeah.
how can he simultaneously expect a civilian phone bank to dismantle it? The math just doesn't work. Grassroots logistics alone cannot break an ironclad theocracy.
And that paradox right there is the exact pivot point of his entire manifesto.
Really? How so?
Because he recognizes that logistical organizing against total tyranny is insufficient. He knows a common minimum program isn't going to survive the secret police.
No.
And because he recognizes that structural failure in his own plan, he introduces this massive, deeply controversial requirement to bridge the gap.
Okay, brace yourselves, because this is where the text gets intensely polarizing.
Right. He claims that for the diaspora's political power to actually work, it has to be supercharged by what he terms achieving spiritual clarity.
And spiritual clarity in Fagat's lexicon is not about, like, going on a retreat and finding inner peace or religious moderation.
No, definitely not.
It is a demand for the Iranian diaspora to collectively, en masse, renounce the religion of Islam.
He argues that the political structure of the Ayatollahs and the theology of Islam are so inextricably fused together that attempting to dismantle one while ignoring the other is just futile.
And he uses a very specific historical analogy to try and justify this.
He does. He asks the reader to imagine Russian dissidents fleeing to the West in 1987 and continuing to be hardcore communists.
He says, why did you flee? What did you flee?
Exactly. It's a fascinating, if strained, mechanical comparison. He is essentially stripping Islam of its status as a spiritual faith.
He's categorizing it entirely as a political ideology of the state, literally identical to Soviet communism.
Right. In his framework, keeping your Islamic faith after fleeing Iran is logically identical to fleeing the Soviet Union, but keeping a bust of Lenin on your mantle.
He views it as a cognitive dissonance that completely cripples the resistance movement.
But to make that argument stick, he has to aggressively deconstruct the theology itself. He has to give the diaspora like a philosophical off-ramp.
So he introduces this rhetorical firewall, trying to explicitly separate the believer from the belief system.
Right. He writes, one has to separate Muslims from Islam. Muslims are human beings who are capable of seeing Islam for what it is.
By doing that, he attempts to shield himself from accusations of bigotry.
Yeah, he frames his attack not as an assault on a demographic of human beings, but as the dismantling of a flawed software program that those humans have been forced to run.
That's a great way to put it, especially given his tech background. But his description of that software is totally uncompromising. He outright declares, Allah is not God.
Yeah, he pulls no punches there.
And then he uses these two deeply American, almost aggressively colloquial analogies to explain how he views the religion. First, he calls it a scam,
He says, the devil sold you the Brooklyn Bridge.
which implies a transaction rooted in total predatory fraud.
Exactly. The whole Brooklyn Bridge scam relies on a con artist selling a monument they have zero claim to, right? They sell it to an immigrant or a mark who just doesn't understand the system.
So Pagat is implying that the theology of Islam is selling a connection to the divine that it structurally does not own.
Right. And his second analogy takes that concept of false ownership and applies it directly to authority.
This one really stood out to me. He compares the religion to someone standing on the sidewalk right outside the IRS headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, picture that.
They intercept you before you walk in the door, and they demand you pay your taxes to them right there on the street. He says explicitly that tax you are paying on the sidewalk is Sharia law.
This is where we really see his systems engineering brain trying to dismantle theology.
How so?
Well, he argues that the true universal God is the actual IRS building, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent.
The ultimate authority.
Exactly. But he claims the theological structure of Islam, specifically Sharia, is this unauthorized parasitic middleman.
Intercepting the believer's genuine spiritual capital.
Yes. He believes the tax collector on the sidewalk has no actual authority, but maintains control entirely through intimidation and inherited habit.
And he roots that intimidation in his own very specific interpretation of history.
He does. He argues that the religion spread through Arab tribes entirely via tyranny.
Right. He says its arrival in ancient Iran was a binary ultimatum: become Muslim or die. Stay Muslim or die.
And he draws this unbroken 1400-year line from that ancient conquest directly to the streets of Tehran in 2026.
He points out that the young protesters being executed by the regime aren't just being killed for civil disobedience.
No, under the regime's theological, legal framework, rebelling against the state means you have abandoned the faith.
Right, which makes you an apostate worthy of death.
And because he sees that unbroken historical line, he believes the only way to shatter the regime's legal and moral authority is for a massive demographic shock to the system.
He throws out a staggering figure here. He suggests that the goal should be to get this message of renunciation to perhaps 75% of the Muslims worldwide.
Which is just a mind-boggling number.
And he actually tries to operationalize this in the real world.
Yeah.
He doesn't just write this as some abstract theory. He targets active politicians.
Yeah, he references an open letter he published addressing a 2026 political figure, Mayor Mamdani of New York.
Pagat notes that the mayor is of Indian descent and publicly demands that the mayor renounce Islam.
He tells the mayor that if he genuinely wants to see an end to the tyranny in Iran, he must recognize that the religion itself is layer upon layer of tyranny and the religion of the devil.
Pagat really believes that a high-profile, cascading series of public renunciations by prominent Muslims in Western democracies is the necessary catalyst.
He thinks that if the psychological dam breaks in places like New York or London, the theological grip inside Iran will fracture.
But, and I'm looking at this purely from an organizing standpoint, this is where the architecture of his entire anti-war strategy kind of collapses under its own contradictions.
Oh, totally. The logistics of his ideology don't align.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of what he is asking for. Segment 1 of his plan. The diaspora builds an umbrella organization based on a common minimum program.
Right.
Now, the very definition of a minimum program is keeping the ideological barrier to entry as low as possible. You want the conservative merchant, the secular student, the liberal artist, all under one tent.
That's how grassroots organizing works.
Right. But then segment 2 of his plan demands that 75% of the global Muslim population abandon their ancestral faith based on his highly specific, aggressive theological deconstruction.
It's a massive contradiction.
How does a movement survive when its minimum requirement for ultimate success is a maximum absolute ideological purity test?
You can't.
You cannot build a broad-based, inclusive logistical coalition while simultaneously demanding that the vast majority of your potential recruits undergo this massive, traumatic religious renunciation.
It is an irreconcilable paradox in his strategy, and Vagot actually seems like marginally aware of the friction.
Does he?
A little bit. He concedes that demanding spiritual clarity might be too much to ask for everyone immediately. He says the common minimum program is enough for now.
Ah, for now. So he's willing to wait.
Right, but his underlying teleological thesis remains constant. Temporary political change might happen via organizing, but permanent, epoch-shifting liberation, the path to his age of abundance, is structurally impossible without that mass religious renunciation.
And as you read deeper into the manifesto, you realize this extreme theological critique isn't just a bespoke solution he engineered for the Iranian crisis.
No, not at all.
The Iranian conflict is just the current laboratory for a unified theory he applies to the entire globe.
He pivots entirely away from the Middle East at this point.
Yeah, he directs this exact same ideological lens toward Western democracies and the Indian subcontinent.
He moves into a section explicitly titled Confronting Islam in the West. And here, he shifts from political organizing to what you could call demographic determinism.
Explain that, because it's a really wild leap.
Okay, so he posits this theory that the core doctrine of Islam dictates a specific mathematical approach to population dynamics in non-Muslim territories.
Right.
He claims that when the population is small, the doctrine mandates that they lie low. But he argues that the moment the demographic crosses a 30% threshold, the strategy automatically shifts to jihad.
It is such a sweeping, monolithic claim. He's flattening incredibly diverse global populations into a single, automated sleeper cell mentality.
Exactly. But because he believes this 30% rule is an ironclad historical constant, he proposes a strict legislative defense mechanism for Western democracies to adopt immediately.
What does he want the West to do?
He argues that the West must absolutely refuse any accommodation of Sharia law. His core democratic thesis is that a functioning democracy cannot tolerate separate legal codes for separate religious communities.
He insists that the secular legislative process is the only valid arena for lawmaking.
Right. He writes, right or wrong, run for office and go to the legislature and shape the laws. That is the only way laws are made in a democracy.
He views any parallel legal structure, even for just civil disputes within a specific community, as a localized surrender of democratic sovereignty.
And to prove his point, he holds up a very specific real-world political battle happening in India.
Yes, he points to the ruling BJP party and their aggressive push for what is known as a uniform civil code.
We need to define the Uniform Civil Code, or UCC, because it's a massive, deeply polarized issue in Indian politics.
Yeah, lay that out for us.
Historically, India has allowed different religious communities, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, to be governed by their own distinct personal laws.
Right. Regarding things like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption.
Exactly. These laws are based on the respective religious scriptures and customs of each group.
And the BJP's push for a uniform civil code aims to abolish those distinct religious laws, right?
Yes. They want to replace them with a single secular set of rules that applies equally to every citizen, completely regardless of their faith.
And Vagat looks at the UCC not just as, like, administrative streamlining. He sees it as the ultimate democratic weapon.
He writes, the BJP wants all citizens of India to have the same laws. The Muslims can't have Sharia law inside India. That is the goal.
For Vagat, the UCC is the blueprint for how the West must defend itself. He warns that if Western democracies continue to allow legal accommodations in the name of multiculturalism, Islam will eat the West from the inside.
And this is where his tendency to collapse time and space becomes really apparent.
Oh, it really does.
He doesn't view geopolitical events, demographic shifts, or isolated acts of violence as having unique modern causes. He views them all through a single, continuous, 1,400-year-old historical filter.
A perfect example of this historical flattening is how he analyzes modern urban terrorism.
Right.
In the text, he brings up a specific scenario he's likely referencing, a real event in his 2026 timeline or the recent past. He talks about a rando Muslim extremist stabbing someone in a London subway.
Now, if you look at an event like that through a modern criminological or sociological lens, you would analyze, say, online radicalization algorithms.
Right, or the individual's mental health, maybe economic disenfranchisement in the UK,
Right.
or specific blowback from Western foreign policy.
Exactly. You'd look at the modern context. But Fagat completely discards all of that. He refuses to see a London subway stabbing as a modern phenomenon.
He writes that the attacker in the subway is doing the exact same thing that was done 1,400 years ago.
He takes a 21st century lone wolf attack and equates it directly to the 7th century raids conducted by early Muslims against rival Arab tribes.
He argues that the underlying mechanics and objectives are completely identical.
Historically, those 7th century raids were economic and psychological warfare. They disrupted trade and created chronic instability.
Which eventually softened the rival tribes, right? Breaking their will to resist and making them easier to absorb or conquer.
Exactly. Fagat claims that modern terrorism, whether it's a highly organized cell or just a random stabbing on a commute, is designed to do the exact same thing.
To instill a baseline of chronic fear, to soften Western psychological defenses for an eventual demographic and theological conquest.
And he maps this identical blueprint of conquest onto India as well, invoking the concept of Ghazwa-e-Hind.
What exactly is that?
It's a controversial theological concept that suggests a prophesied final battle in the Indian subcontinent, resulting in its total conversion to Islam.
So Fagat views the resistance to the Uniform Civil Code in India, the subway stabbings in London, and the execution of protesters in Iran not as separate political issues.
No, he sees them as different operational branches of the exact same 1,400-year-old war machine.
It is the ultimate grand unifying theory of conflict.
It really is. But grand unifying theories are inherently dangerous because they require you to amputate any data that doesn't perfectly fit your model.
Right. By insisting that a teenager radicalized on some social media platform in London is operating with the exact same strategic intent as a 7th century cavalry raid.
He is basically stripping away all the actual leverage points we have to solve modern problems.
Exactly. You can't dismantle online radicalization pipelines if you insist the real problem is a 1,400-year-old tribal doctrine.
You're ignoring the actual mechanisms of the present.
But because he genuinely believes this existential, unyielding historical war is actively happening right now, his strategy undergoes a final, violent mutation.
Yeah, this is where the tone shifts dramatically.
In a section of the manifesto ominously titled The Need to Fight, the guy who literally titled his essay, "I have been anti-war all along," drops the grassroots organizing rhetoric completely.
The Obama volunteer persona completely vanishes here.
It does. He pivots hard into justifying some of the most aggressive, proactive military doctrines imaginable.
He creates this absolute moral binary. He states flatly, "The truly evil do not reason, they fight to the finish." And the correct decision there is to fight back.
And when he looks around the globe for a model of how to successfully fight back against what he perceives as this unified existential threat, he points directly to Israel as the trailblazer.
And he doesn't just offer, vague support for Israel. He highly praises a very specific, highly controversial aspect of their military strategy.
Yeah, he praises the fact that in their pursuit of dismantling terror organizations, they don't recognize anyone's sovereignty any more than the terrorists do.
That is a profound Machiavellian endorsement of violating international law.
Completely. The entire post-WWII global order is built on the concept of national sovereignty.
Right, the idea that you cannot simply cross borders and conduct military operations or assassinations in another country without authorization.
But Fagat is arguing that against this specific enemy, the concept of sovereignty is a lethal fiction that must be ignored.
And he justifies this brutal clarity of action with a really grim calculus. He writes that the logic is, even if the population still hates you, if their organizational structure is kaput, they will not be able to hurt you.
He claims this is correct thinking.
He argues that taking out command structures, ignoring borders to assassinate leaders, and physically dismantling logistical networks actually minimizes death and destruction in the long run.
Because it prevents future, larger-scale wars.
Right. He has fully transitioned from a community organizer demanding a common minimum program to a geopolitical hawk advocating for preemptive, extrajudicial strikes.
It is severe cognitive whiplash. I mean, we started this deep dive looking at a man who wanted to build an age of abundance using agentic AI and velocity money, a man who wrote books about the spiritual redemption of Kalkiism. How does a utopian futurist reconcile this dark, bloody, sovereignty-ignoring military stance with his vision of a technologically enlightened peace?
Well, you have to look at how utopians historically view the present.
Okay, unpack that for me.
To a teleological thinker like Fagat, the present world, with its entrenched theocracies, its messy international laws, its inherited religious dogmas, It's fundamentally broken.
Right.
And it is incapable of reaching the age of abundance on its own. The utopian future he envisions requires a clean slate.
So he believes the old world has to be essentially burned away.
Exactly. On one side of his ideology is this glittering post-scarcity AI utopia. On the other side is brutal, Machiavellian realpolitik.
And he genuinely believes that crossing this incredibly violent, unstable geopolitical bridge, toppling the Iranian regime, dismantling Islam, ignoring borders to crush terror groups, is the only way humanity can survive to reach the other side.
He is essentially attempting to engineer the apocalypse to force the millennium.
Which brings us to the most vital takeaway of this entire deep dive.
The really big picture.
Right. We spent this time mapping the architecture of Paramendra Kumar Bhagat's worldview, not because it is the definitive truth of 2026.
No, definitely not.
But because of what it reveals about the information ecosystem we are currently living in. Think about the environment that allows a manifesto like this to exist in the first place.
Right. A few decades ago, a sweeping, multidisciplinary, highly controversial worldview like this, one that blends AI forecasting, Hindu prophecy, and hawkish military strategy.
It would have been filtered through a massive editorial apparatus.
Exactly. Think tanks, publishers, and editors would have forced the author to pick a lane.
They would have smoothed the edges and demanded rigorous peer review for all those historical and demographic claims.
The friction of distribution used to serve as a moderating force.
But in the 2026 digital landscape, the friction of distribution is absolute zero.
Yeah, a single individual can self-publish dozens of interconnected books spanning genres from economics to sci-fi.
They can build a 2-decade-long blog archive, amass 5 million page views, and broadcast these sprawling, highly personalized meta-narratives directly into the global slipstream.
And they can do it without a single editorial gatekeeper saying, hey, wait a minute, how does a million phone calls actually work under a surveillance state?
And they can do all of this while the world is actively on fire. I mean, remember the news headlines visible on his site alongside this post.
The Strait of Hormuz blocked.
Meta's embrace of AI is making its employees miserable. AI populism is here. We are entering an era where the barrier to creating comprehensive, interconnected alternate realities is totally disappearing.
With the rise of agentic AI and generative text models, anyone can theoretically construct an exhaustive, beautifully formatted ideological universe.
A universe that seamlessly blends genuine, terrifying geopolitical news with their own highly bespoke religious prophecies and utopian technological solutions.
It's a completely new paradigm of information warfare and propaganda.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to really mull over.
Yeah.
When you are faced with an archive of dozens of books, millions of words, and a supremely confident voice offering a grand unified theory for every single global crisis, how will we, as consumers of information, learn to distinguish between a visionary strategist who genuinely sees the whole board
and an airtight, self-reinforcing echo chamber built by and for an audience of one?
It's the defining challenge of our era. Thanks for joining us in the deep end. We'll catch you next time.